behavior, beasts of prey, far from being cooperative and peace-seeking creatures. The very freedom that such beings as ourselves enjoy in the state of nature leads us to abuse that freedom, and in turn requires or is at the basis of the need for civil government. However, in the meantime, the question that any reader of the second treatise has to ask of themselves, and I hope you put this forward in your sections to one another, is whether the natural condition, as Locke understands it, is one overseen by a moral law of justifying or sanctifying peace and security, or whether Locke's state of nature is simply a thinly veiled description, a thinly papered over description of the Hobbesian war of all against all. Was Locke simply Hobbes in some way in sheep's clothing? Remember his famous taciturnity. Locke seems to be speaking two very different languages, in other words. One of traditional natural law that holds out duties to others as primary, and the other, in some ways, a modern Hobbesian conception of natural rights that maintains the priority of right and each individual's right to self-preservation. Is Locke, in other words, and this is perhaps more of an historical than a theoretical question, is Locke a member of the ancient, in some ways Ciceronian and Thomistic tradition of natural law, or a modern Hobbesian? Do his politics derive from a theological conception of divine workmanship, or an ultimately, you might say, naturalistic conception or account of the human passions and the struggle for survival? Do his priorities go to duties or to rights? Or is Locke simply confused? Is he confusing two different languages, or is he being intentionally ambiguous in his account? A recent book by a well-known scholar of Locke has argued, I think quite powerfully in some ways, that Locke's idea of equality in the state of nature specifically relies upon a certain kind of Christian theological context of argument. Locke's statement in paragraph 4 of the second treatise, his statement that there being nothing more evident than that creatures of the same species and rank promiscuously born to all the same advantages of nature should also be equal to one another. That Locke's statement that creatures of the same species and rank should be equal to one another, this is said to rely upon and depend upon a very specific religious argument, what it means to belong to a species, and why belonging to the same species confers a special rank or dignity on each of its members only makes sense, according to this recent interpretation, if you believe, or if it is believed, that the species in question has a specifically moral relation to God. The question, I think, is whether Locke's idea of equality in the state of nature, or his idea of the moral law in the state of nature, relies upon this belief, or whether it can be inferred from such things as the basic principles of freedom, whether this can be inferred, as it were, from purely non-theological, naturalistic premises or grounds. Locke, to be sure, is silent in the second treatise about the theological foundations of his position. There are no discussions of important theological figures such as Jesus or St. Paul or the New Testament, at least in the second treatise. He discusses these issues at length elsewhere. These may be in some way thought of as background considerations, but the question remains, I think, for us, whether these are deeply embedded in Locke's arguments about divine workmanship, or whether or not that language of divine workmanship simply serves as a kind of window dressing, again, for a purely secular, naturalistic theory of human nature and political authority. Very important issue, I think, in coming to understand Locke, and indirectly very important for how we come to think of the American regime. Because I'll just say simply as a kind of footnote to what I've been saying, if Locke is thought of in some ways as his doctrine as being in some ways at the founding principles of the American regime, Declaration of Independence most notably, it becomes very important. It becomes part of a contemporary public argument whether those foundations owe their authority to some kind of theological doctrine, as Jefferson calls it in the opening of the Declaration, the laws of nature and nature's God, seems in some way to have kind of Lockean overtones to it. Do our founding documents imply a theology of some kind, the laws of nature and nature's God? Or are those principles, again, purely of a naturalistic, secular kind that can do without theology altogether? That is an argument, a kind of scholarly and academic argument, to be sure, but it spills over into many of our public debates over the role or place of religion in public life. Whenever we talk about issues of the appropriateness of issues like school prayer, or should the Ten Commandments be publicly displayed in courthouses or in other public places, or if you want to take another famous Jeffersonian position, is there a kind of absolute firewall, a wall of separation between religion and the state? These issues that we very much work on today and think about are, you can see, deeply embedded in how we think about Locke and those opening sections of the second treatise dealing with natural law and the state of nature. So you can see again how these ideas penetrate deeply into the marrow of our public or political culture. Are we so different? Have we become so different? Will people living 300 years from now think of us as so different, and our public debate so different from those that animated the public issues in the time of John Locke? Maybe not. Maybe we aren't that different. So, okay, enough for contemporary. Let me go back to Mr. Locke. The core of Locke's theory of natural law in the state of nature is arguably lodged in his account of property, chapter 5 of the second treatise. If you remember anything about Locke after this class, remember chapter 5. It is, by all accounts, maybe chapter 19 as well, the theory of revolution, but chapter 5, account of property, certainly in many ways one of the most characteristic doctrines of Lockean political thought. Locke's view of human nature is that we are very much the property-acquiring animal. Aristotle had said we were political by nature. Locke says we are property-acquiring beings. Our claims to property derive from our work. The fact that we have expended our labor, our work on something, gives us a title to it. Labor confers value and is the source of all values. The state of nature is a condition, he tells us, of communal ownership, what Karl Marx would have called primitive communism. The state of nature is given to all men in common, Locke says. It only becomes, parts only of it become private property only when we add our labor to something. Let me read a famous formula in from sections 27 and 28. Every man, Locke says, has property in his person. This nobody has any right to but himself. We all, in other words, have a certain, we come into the world with a certain private property in our person. No one else has a right to that. The labor of his body, Locke continues, and the work of his hands, we may say, are properly his. For labor being the unquestionable property of the laborer, no man but he can have a right to what is once joined to, at least where there is enough as good left in common for others. That labor, Locke says, puts a distinction between him and the common. That added something to them more than nature, the common mother of all, had done, and so they become his private right. So we have moved here in this one paragraph from the state of nature, which he says is common to all, to a condition of rudimentary private property, which we have in our body, our person, which he says also includes the labor of the body and the work of the hands, how we expend our activity. That labor, he says, which puts something between us and the common, becomes the source of ownership of things around us, and that ownership then in turn becomes a right. So they become, he concludes there, his private right. The